Welcome! This time on WoodWorks, we'll make this sturdy mahogany wine rack with these black walnut accents. So join us! Hi, I'm David Marks. Welcome to WoodWorks. Today's project, this mahogany wine rack, is going to teach us some advanced techniques in biscuit joinery. We're also going to learn how some simple banding and capping can supplement the style and finish. And along the way, we'll share some tips about templates, layouts, and design. Deceptively simple in its design, this wine rack embodies strength. The classic symmetry of the honeycomb storage shelves please the eye and provide strong support. The rich tones of mahogany are enhanced by the accents of black walnut. A sturdy and stunning piece of wall art and furniture. We can look at this project in two parts, the outside case and the inside honeycomb structure. But the key ingredient to this project is the template. Now the layout to this design is critical to the strength and character of the finished rack. But it all starts with a drawing and some planning. This is the template we made from our initial design. It's made from some 1/2-inch MDF and some plywood. The plywood represents the outside of our case, and this is basically a jig to make sure that all of our parts will fit inside. Think of it as a map or a guide to cutting our pieces. It ensures that all of our pieces will fit in here properly and that our corners will be square. Now we've determined that the outside of our case is going to be 46 inches wide, and the great thing about that is it ensures that we can get all of our parts out of one sheet of 4x8 plywood. To lay out the diamonds onto our template, we'll use a little geometry. Since the shelves are symmetrical, we find the center point of each diamond that touches the case. We then use a compass to draw a circle that is the thickness of the boards. From that point, we draw out our 45-degree angles and determine the height of our case and the size of our internal boxes. Now that we know the dimensions of all of our parts and pieces, it's time to prep our materials. So for our wine rack, we're going to be using some 3/4-inch Honduras mahogany plywood. Now obviously, anytime you cut into some plywood, you're going to expose this inner core. So to deal with that, and to give our front edge a nice accent, we're going to cap the front edge with black walnut. Now on just the sides of the outside of the case, on both ends, we're going to cap these with some Honduras mahogany. And that way it'll just blend in with the rest of the sides. So we'll start by milling up our black walnut and our mahogany on the bandsaw. We only need a strip of stock that's 1/16 of an inch thick. Next, we run the stock through the drum sander. Then, we glue our strips to the end of our mahogany plywood and clamp it. Once it's dry, we trim the end caps even with our plywood using the flush bearing bit at the router table. We finished flush trimming our mahogany. Now we're ready to band the front edge of this and the rest of our stock in black walnut. Using the bandsaw, we cut our walnut into strips 3/16 of an inch thick. Then, we use the drum sander to get it to final thickness. We're gluing our black walnut banding to the edge of our mahogany plywood. Now we're gluing these up in longer lengths for efficiency because later on we'll be cutting these into short sections for the inside of our wine rack. Now here's a time-saving tip. By taking these two pieces of plywood and facing them together and then keeping our black walnut on the inside, we can use less clamps and speed up the gluing time. And here's one last tip. By using some shim stock underneath the plywood, you can ensure that the walnut banding overhangs the edge of the plywood evenly, and that way you've got plenty of material to flush trim off later on. Once the glue is dried, we trim the edges with a handsaw. Then, we remove the excess walnut banding with a flush bearing bit at the router table. Next, we install a radius bit to round over the edges of the walnut banding. Here, we are only working on the stock for the honeycomb. We'll work with the stock for the case later. Let's take a closer look at the parts for our wine rack on this example. Now, rather than having a flat, flush rack, we've decided to add more of a three-dimensional quality and texture to the piece by having our case set at 1 dimension, our long diagonals set back 1/4 of an inch, and our short diagonals set back 1/4 of an inch further. The stair-step effect really enhances the look. Now we're going to need 3 different widths for our stock, so we'll rip those to width on the table saw. We use pressure rollers because they hold the boards firmly against the table saw and prevent kickback. We've measured our long diagonals up against our template. Now we're ready to cut them to length. To do that, we're going to be using the crosscut sled here at the table saw with our blade set at 45 degrees. Now we've designed our wine rack so that our honeycomb sits at a 45-degree angle. That means that we're going to have to cut this edge at a 45-degree angle. That'll enable us to make sure that it sits up flush up against the inside of the case. We're back over here at our template so we can finish up laying out our diagonals. Now we've cut our diagonals a little bit oversized, and that way we can shave them down so that they fit in snugly inside of our plywood frame. So now we're ready to make the determination for our short diagonals. Now to do that, we're using these spacers. Now what's important about the short diagonals is that they're all exactly the same length and that they fit in here snugly, and that'll maintain symmetry throughout our wine rack. So to do that, we're using these spacers so that we don't have to practice on our expensive plywood. Now we've started out with our spacers being a little bit long, and we've gradually shaved these down until we've got a snug fit. So with this last one fitting snugly into place, now we've got the length we need to cut our short diagonals. We use a stop block to batch cut all of our pieces the same length at the table saw. We're just dry fitting the last few pieces of our honeycomb to make sure they fit our template. Now here's some essential information. We've labeled the bottom of each piece of plywood with a letter and an arrow. And that corresponds to a letter and an arrow on our template and on our drawing. Now that'll be essential to make sure that we avoid any confusion when it comes to the process of doing our joinery. Now we're ready to start the joinery. We're going to be using biscuits to join our honeycomb together. Now we're going to be using the smallest possible size they have, which is called a 0 biscuit. Now I've got our honeycomb dry clamped together, and that way we can mark the center lines on these long diagonals where these dividers meet. And we'll know exactly where to cut the slots for our biscuit joinery. Now here's something else to watch out for. On the ends of the honeycomb, where we have this 45-degree angle, there's the potential for the biscuits to poke through. So to compensate, we slightly offset these towards the inside, and as a reminder, we've put a little bit of green tape on the edge here. Now we've got a lot of joinery to cut, so to make life easier, we've made ourselves a jig. Whenever you have a lot of cuts to make, it's a good idea to have a system in place. Now we're going to start by batch cutting these short dividers. And to do that, we'll be using this simple jig. This is made out of some 1/2-inch MDF. We have a stop block clamped into place so we can register our stock off of that. We've got a center line marked and 2 evenly spaced lines so we know where to cut our slots. Now our biscuit joiner is set to cut to the center of a 3/4 inch piece of plywood. So all we've got to do is to line up on these pencil lines, cut our slots, and then we'll flip it end for end, cut the slots on the other side, and then we can proceed that way through the whole rest of the batch. Now we're at the stage of the batch cutting where we're doing the offset. Now remember that green tape that we put on earlier? That's just to indicate which side is going to get the offset. Now to achieve that, we've simply double stick taped on a thin shim of cardboard to the bottom of our biscuit joiner, and that'll help to give us that offset that we need. Now remember, always position the green tape down. That'll just make sure that the offset goes to the correct side. It's a good idea to consult your drawing and template as you work with each piece. By doing this offset, we'll ensure that the biscuits won't cut through the mitered side. Next, we'll cut the corresponding offsets in the ends of our long diagonals, using the same setup on our biscuit joiner and the same setup on our jig, but only when the back of our stock is up against our stop block. Now for the other side, we've got the walnut banding up against the stop block. We're going to have to reset this back about 1/4 of an inch to compensate for the extra width of this long diagonal. Make sure you orient yourself with a drawing on every cut. This will ensure you make no mistakes. To cut the biscuit slots in the middle of the boards, we've made another jig. We'll clamp the jig 3/8 of an inch off the center lines we made using our green tape as a guide. We start our glue up. We're going to be doing this in stages because trying to glue up a honeycomb of this size all at once would be very difficult. Now here's some more advice, is it's a good idea to check back to your template and to your drawing and to reference the letters off of the bottom just so you don't get lost along the way. Here's our glue up strategy. We'll begin by gluing up this portion of the honeycomb and then attach it to this part. Because of the symmetry of the shelves, we'll glue up the other side exactly the same way. And then, after they're dry, we'll join the two halves together. We begin our assembly by applying yellow glue to our biscuits. We attach our sides and then place the top piece. Be very careful not to overglue because cleanup will be difficult after the whole structure is assembled, so clean up as you go. We use 2 clamps to secure it and let it dry. Now we'll glue up the second part. We start by adding the sides to the long diagonal, and then we add the dried first stage we just completed on top. Finally, using cawls, we'll clamp the assembly to the workbench. This is 1/2 of the honeycomb. Now this might look like a complicated glue up, but really it's not. All we're doing is gluing these last 2 halves together right along this center line. Now because we've glued this up in stages, and we've been very careful as we've gone along, and we've checked everything for square, and we've cleaned up the corners, this last glue up is a low stress operation. All we got to do is check and make sure the corners are square. Now that we've got all that dialed in, we just tighten up our clamps and give the glue a couple of hours to dry. The glue is dried on our honeycomb, and now we're dry fitting it back into our template. We're doing that to make sure that nothing changed on our honeycomb when we glued it up. Now that we know that it fits back into the template, all we need to do is to take some measurements off this inside frame, and that'll give us the dimensions that we need to cut our case stock to length. Next, we'll add some shape and dimension to the case by making a radius cut on all the edges of the case stock. On the side pieces, we make a stop radius on the inside edges so they'll match up with the top and bottom pieces and we won't have any gaps. We now cut the top and bottom pieces of the case to length. The sides are cut to length by making trim cuts on the ends where the mahogany was capped. We've got the pieces cut for the sides of our case. We're checking the fit to our honeycomb. Next, we'll complete the case for our wine rack. We've already cut the biscuit slots in the top and bottom and sides of our case. We'll use to join these corners together. So now we'll tap these together and dry fit them and check these corners. And while we're doing that, we can lay out some marks that we'll use for the biscuit joinery for attaching the ends of our honeycomb to the sides of our case. We start by making a center line on the edges of the honeycomb. Then transfer those lines to the matching sections of the case. We're extending our center line onto the outside edges of our honeycomb so we can lay out our biscuits. Now we're going to be using the same jig that we used earlier, except this time we have some marks that we laid out on the back side, and we use those to determine the layout for our spacing. Next, to cut the biscuits on the outside of our honeycomb, which will attach to the case, we use a spacer to help reference our jig. This will help compensate for the step down between our case and the long diagonals. The fence on our biscuit joiner is set to 45 degrees to get a solid reference. Then we set the fence to 90 degrees and cut the slots in the top, bottom, and sides of our case. This time, we remove the spacer from the jig so the slots on our case will match up with the ones on our honeycomb. With our joinery made, now we're ready to glue our case to our honeycomb. We start by gluing the bottom of the case to the honeycomb and clamping it securely as we go. Then we add the top. And finally, we add the sides of our case, clamping to the corners of our honeycomb. Before we make our back panel, we cut a rabbet in the back of our case. To avoid chip out of the plywood stock, we make 2 passes with our hand router. Once the rabbet is cut, we take a sharp chisel and square up all 4 corners. Then, at the table saw, we cut our back panel to final dimension out of 1/2-inch mahogany plywood. We're just fitting our plywood back panel into our wine rack. Now we want a snug fit, so just a few more passes with our hand plane and we'll be ready to glue it in. Now we're ready to add the back panel. Because this back panel is going to be attached to the wall, it's going to bear the weight of this whole rack and all the bottles in it. So we're going to make sure that this back panel is glued solidly into this rabbet. Yellow glue will give us a good strong bond. We want to make sure we use enough to do the job, but not so much that we get a lot of squeeze out inside the honeycomb where it will be difficult to clean up. We also want to clamp it securely to make sure we get a uniform bond. We just gave the glue a couple of hours to dry. Now all we need to do is give it a good going over with some 220 grit sandpaper, and then we're ready to put the finish on. For the finish, we use a commercial combination of tung oil, linseed oil, and polyurethane. Our wine rack is both sturdy and symmetrical with its beautiful black walnut accents. The profile of the recessed alcoves please the eye, and the symmetrical honeycomb storage shelves present an ideal setting for laying down your favorite bottles of wine. One last thing. By using 1/2-inch mahogany plywood on the back of our wine cabinet, it's strong enough to mount directly to the wall. But before you do, make sure that you locate a couple of studs in the wall. Thanks for being with us. I'm David Marks. We'll see you again next time on WoodWorks.